My name is Captain James Walker. I'm 37 years old and I serve as a logistics officer in the United States Army. Most people don't know what that means, but in short, it's my job to make sure the right equipment gets to the right people at the right time, especially when lives are on the line. I was recently stationed at Fort Brazos in Texas. It's hot, dry, and stretched thin like most bases these days. But that doesn't change what I do. Whether it's blood packs for field medics, pressure regulators for portable oxygen units, or just making sure body armor gets where it's needed, I track it, check it, and sign off on every piece like it was going to my own brother. I come from a long line of men who wore the uniform. My grandfather was Navy. My father served in the Army, just like me. He took shrapnel in the thigh during a supply run when I was a kid. The convoy was supposed to have armored plating, but someone cut corners, said it was too expensive. I still remember helping him clean the scar tissue when he got home. That's when I decided logistics wasn't just a desk job. It was defense. Invisible, but critical. Most people see soldiers as the ones kicking down doors or flying helicopters. I respect that, but I was never built for glory. I was built for order, for making sure no one has to fight without what they need to stay alive. My job is to remove doubt from the system, to make sure when a medic reaches for a tool in the field, it works every single time. Some call it boring. I call it sacred. Every checklist, every manifest, every barcode scan means fewer surprises when it matters most. That's how I sleep at night. Knowing that somewhere someone made it home because what I packed did what it was supposed to. Fort Brazos is where I thought I'd keep doing that work. Quiet. Consistent. Just another base. Another round of inventory. Another set of officers with their own way of doing things. I wasn't expecting anything unusual. I definitely wasn't prepared for what came next. But looking back now, maybe that was Navy. Because when you start pulling the threads of a broken system, you have to be ready for what unravels. And the thing about truth is once you see it, you can't go back to pretending it's not there. My name is Captain James Walker. I wasn't trained for politics. I was trained to keep people alive. And that's exactly what I intended to do, until the system turned against me. The first thing that caught my eye was a shipment log that didn't match. A batch of portable defibrillators listed as field tested and approved came in without serial scans. No inspection signature, no thermal load report, just a stamped pass and a ship date. I flagged it for review and figured maybe someone had gotten lazy. It happens. But when I brought it up to Lieutenant Grant, he just glanced at the page and said he'd look into it later. Later never came. And 2 days later, another manifest crossed my desk. This one was for blood pressure regulators bound for an outpost in Kandahar. Same issue. Marked approved, but the calibration specs were inconsistent with the model listed. I went down to the loading bay myself and found the crates. The labels had been peeled and reprinted. Not once, but twice. Underneath the fresh barcode was an older one half torn. The manufacturer ID was different. That night, I couldn't sleep. Something wasn't adding up. I'd been in logistics long enough to know when corners were cut. This wasn't cutting corners. This was deliberate. The next morning, I asked Carla, one of our veteran techs, if she remembered running diagnostics on that batch. She blinked fast like I'd startled her. Then she shook her head and said she didn't handle that set. I pointed out her initials on the prep sheet. She just looked past me and mumbled that it must have been a clerical error. Then she picked up her clipboard and walked off. But right before she turned the corner, she stopped, looked back and said, just loud enough for me to hear, "Don't dig too deep, Captain." That sat with me. More than anything else. It wasn't what she said. It was how she said it. Like someone who knew more but didn't dare say. The next week, I kept noticing more. IV pumps with mismatched serials. Tourniquet kits that failed tensile tests but still got cleared. And every time I asked, someone acted confused or made a joke or told me not to worry. It was always brushed off, as an admin issue or old data not syncing. But I'd seen old data before. This wasn't old. It was altered, changed just enough to get bad equipment through the system. And nobody wanted to talk about it. I cornered Staff Sergeant Hale in the break room one afternoon and asked about a shipment that had come back marked field damage, defective seals. He looked at the ceiling, exhaled, and told me to let it go. Said we weren't the ones on the front lines. Said sometimes specs are just guidelines. That's when it clicked. They all knew. Maybe not the full picture, but enough to look the other way. Enough to not ask questions. I started staying late, going through archived inspection logs, comparing them with the revised summaries. There were dozens of mismatches, then hundreds. I created a private drive, copied what I could without tripping alerts, kept the flash drive in my glove compartment, started dating everything, labeling edits, building a timeline, because the deeper I went, the clearer it became. This wasn't one bad batch. It wasn't lazy paperwork. It was a pattern. And patterns don't happen by accident. They happen by design. I walked into Colonel Briggs's office just after 800. He was on the phone, staring out the window with his back to me. He waved a hand without turning around, told me to wait. When he finally hung up, he sat down slowly, like nothing in the world was urgent. I placed the folder on his desk. It was thick. Tabs marked. Summaries clipped. He glanced at it, then leaned back in his chair. Didn't reach for it. Didn't ask a single question. Just folded his arms and gave me that half smile people use when they've already decided you're wasting their time. I told him what I'd found. Model mismatches, failed test specs, calibration logs rewritten. I spoke calmly. Just facts. He nodded a little like he was listening to weather. Then he said it. You were brought here to keep things moving, not to play hero. The words landed hard. Not loud. Not cruel. Just final. I looked at the folder again. Still untouched. He hadn't even shifted it an inch. Like the truth sitting between us wasn't even worth a second glance. I asked if he was going to escalate it. He didn't answer right away. Just let the silence fill the room. Then he said sometimes operational fluidity matters more than technical precision. That's when I realized he already knew. Or if he didn't know before he understood enough now and didn't care. That was worse. I stood there still trying to find something to say. A reason to stay. A reason to believe this was just misunderstanding, not betrayal. But Briggs just leaned forward and tapped the folder with one finger. Said the chain of command doesn't run on drama. It runs on discipline. I picked the folder back up. Not because I wanted to. Because I didn't want to leave it there to be trashed the moment I walked out. As I stepped outside, the door closed behind me with a soft click. No raised voices. No slammed fists. Just that cold, empty finality you only hear when someone shows you who they really are. And for the first time since arriving at Fort Brazos, I didn't feel like an officer. I felt like a problem no one wanted to deal with. The envelope was already sitting on my desk when I got back from the colonel's office. Heavy paper. My name typed clean across the front. Inside was a contract marked revised terms. A bump in salary, new title, and a few added clauses. One of them was confidentiality. Another covered media interaction. All of it framed like routine paperwork. Vivian from HR showed up 5 minutes later, smiling too wide. She said it was a chance to redefine my role and get into more strategic operations. I asked if the timing was coincidence. She didn't blink. I left the envelope unopened and set it aside. Just looking at it made my throat tighten. Not from fear, but from something that felt like warning. Carla stopped by before the end of the day. Knocked softly, stayed by the door. She didn't say much. Just that she'd heard about the offer and hoped I'd make the smart choice. Then she looked at me a second too long. Like she wanted to say more, but couldn't. Before she turned to leave, her voice dropped. Sometimes silence is the safest path. That night, I didn't turn on the lights when I got home. Sat at the kitchen table with just the glow from my laptop. I couldn't shake the weight of that envelope or the way Carla looked at me. Around 11 p.m., the email came in. No subject. No sender. Just a zip file with over 24 attachments. Original inspection files. Unaltered thermal test results. Photos of cracked frames, warped seals. Alongside them, polished summaries with fake pass stamps. Each one paired like a before and after. At the bottom of the message was one line. Garcia didn't resign. He was pushed. I leaned back in the chair, hands frozen on the keyboard. Garcia was the logistics officer before me. No one ever talked about why he left. Just said he had health issues and couldn't handle the pressure. But that line hit hard, because I already knew the pressure wasn't from the job. It was from knowing the truth and realizing no one wanted it told. I closed the laptop and sat still for a long time. The envelope was still in my bag. I could have signed it. Moved on. Pretended none of this mattered. But then I remembered my father's scarred hands. And I knew I couldn't. I walked into the conference room feeling unusually calm. The walls were glass, the table long and polished, and 12 officers already seated with their folders open. I started my slide deck exactly on schedule, unaware of how tightly the trap had been set. I clicked to the first chart, showing failed calibration readings, then the second slide with mismatched serial numbers, and I felt a flicker of surprise when half the room shifted in their chairs. I glanced at the small recorder I'd tucked in my jacket pocket and nodded to myself silently. Somehow I knew this moment was bigger than the numbers. 10 minutes in, I saw the pattern. The officers were listening, not engaging. Then, one man stood up, mid-slide, folded his folder, and announced that this meeting was over. 12 chairs scraped against the floor in perfect sync. The man who walked out last didn't meet my eyes. He said no one was going to read this report. He turned off the projector with a smooth motion and the room went dark. And when the lights came back on, the red warning icons from my last slide still glowed on the wall. I stood there with the clicker in one hand and the remote for the projector in the other, the entire room empty. Except for me. The hush that followed felt colder than any confrontation, because there was no fight, no argument, just abandonment. My chest tightened. I wasn't embarrassed. I was clear. I realized they already knew what I was doing. They treated me like a technician who wandered into the wrong space. With the recorder still running, I calmly gathered my laptop and files and walked out using the side door, the one I'd scoped a week before, in case things changed fast. Outside the door, I didn't break stride. I breathed deeply. The recorder was collecting everything. The click of the projector switched the tapping heels of boots, the final words I'd heard. That tape would tell the story I couldn't shout yet. Back at my desk, I looked at the recording's timestamp and let myself feel a fraction of relief. They thought I was done. They thought they silenced me with darkness and departure. But the recorder had listened. The recorder had seen. I spent the rest of that afternoon thinking about what this meant. I'd joined the military to serve, to support those who depended on logistic precision. I never signed up for politics. Yet here I was in the quietest room on base facing the loudest betrayal. I knew the uniform I wore carried weight, and in that weight I understood something important. Sometimes you carry more than you think. The officers outside the glass room probably assumed the show ended when they walked out. They didn't know the recordings began the moment I hit play. They didn't know the system had built the trap, but I'd accepted it. The lesson was there. Even before the tape, I would not walk away intimidated. Later that night, I went over the slides again and deleted the version that included their names bulked out in the middle. I kept the version that captured their walkout, the announcement, and the final switch off in the dark. I labeled it Evidence Meeting A. I duplicated it into a hidden folder. I backed up the file to a drive I keep in my glove compartment. because this meeting looked like defeat. It probably felt like one to others watching. But in truth, it was the pivot. Instead of being silenced, I had stepped into a lens. When you're prepared to be ignored by the system you work for, you find a new audience waiting. And mine was just getting started. I walked out of the building with my chest tight and hands still slightly shaking. The late afternoon air hit my face like a wall, and I kept walking until the noise of boots and doors faded behind me. I stopped by the far fence right where the service trucks load in and pulled out my phone. It rang twice. Eliza picked up with a calm voice that felt like steel under velvet. I told her it went exactly like she said it would. Every cue, every reaction, the walkout, the insult, the lights. She was silent for a second, then asked if I had everything recorded. I said yes. 10 weeks worth. Meeting rooms, shop floors, even the talk in the parking lot. She told me to hold tight. No calls, no contact, no emails. Stay visible but quiet. The team was moving. I asked how soon. She didn't say. Just to be ready. I ended the call and put my phone back in my pocket, then leaned against the fence. The hum of nearby HVAC units filled the silence. My breath slowed. Everything I'd done led to this moment, and now the only thing left was to wait. No one had followed me. No one had shouted after me in the hall. It was like I'd disappeared even before the system kicked me out. I looked down at the boots on my feet and wondered how many miles they'd walked keeping others alive. Today they'd walked me to war without a weapon. I didn't feel brave. I felt clear. The kind of clarity that comes when there's nothing left to hide. I didn't know how long I'd be waiting, but I knew what I was waiting for. And that was enough to keep me standing still. They came in just after sunrise. 4 black SUVs rolled through the checkpoint like they owned the road. No salutes, no announcements, just quiet steps and clipped commands. The insignias on their shoulders read Office of the Inspector General. By the time they reached the admin, word had started to spread. Doors closed a little faster. Conversations dropped mid-sentence. Some of the same officers who had walked out of my meeting last week were now avoiding eye contact, like I carried something contagious. Eliza was the last to enter. Her stride calm, purposeful, the same look on her face as the day she told me to wait. She didn't waste time. Her team spread through the base like trained fire. Paper trails were pulled. Devices imaged. No one was yelling, but the silence they carried was louder than any siren. I was told to meet in the main conference room at 900. Same chairs, same table, same projector, but everything else had shifted. This time they were the ones waiting when I walked in. No one stood. A few gave stiff nods. Colonel Briggs was there, seated at the far end with arms crossed and jaw locked. I connected the drive, pulled up the video file. No introduction, just play. The screen lit up with the footage from the last meeting. My voice came through clear and steady, pointing to calibration errors and missing serials. Then the sound of chairs moving. Boots scraping. One by one they stood and walked out. And then that final line. The room fell still as it played. No one spoke when the clip ended. Eliza stood at the front of the room, hands folded. Then she clicked to the next slide. Raw data. Inspection logs. Red flags highlighted in quiet detail. Ghost signatures, backdated approvals, test reports written before the tests ever happened. As she moved through the evidence, the shift was slow but visible. Arrogance turned to disbelief. Disbelief melted into tension. Some officers looked down. Others exchanged glances that said more than words could. Then she handed out the subpoenas. Briggs tried to interrupt, but she kept going, voice low and unshaken. She named each infraction. Named the officers who signed off. Some had already packed their things. Others had been pulled from their offices mid-call. Monroe was missing. His office cleared. His files scrubbed. But the trail left behind was enough to show this wasn't neglect. It was orchestration. Carla sat 2 rows back. She didn't move. She didn't blink. Just stared straight ahead like she'd been holding her breath for weeks. When her name came up, Eliza looked at her, told her she had a choice. Cooperate fully and honestly, or face the same consequences. Carla nodded once, quietly, and finally breathed. I watched all of it from my seat near the wall. I didn't speak, didn't smile. This wasn't about being right. This wasn't about payback. This was about the names on the manifests who never made it home because someone decided profits were more important than precious seals. The meeting ended. Officers escorted out, some silent, some still trying to talk their way out. But it was done. I walked out into the hallway and sat on the bench by the window. The same bench where I used to check shipment logs between rotations. Now the screen showed notification after notification. Internal investigations, pending charges, early retirements. Eliza sat beside me. She didn't say anything at first, just looked out at the training field. Then she turned and said the thing I hadn't let myself believe until now. You did the right thing, even when no one wanted you to. I nodded. My throat was too tight to answer. She stood and left her team following her down the hall, and I stayed there for a long while, letting it settle. Not the victory, but the truth, that it had finally been seen. The sun was just starting to rise when I sat down at the kitchen table, my hands wrapped around a chipped ceramic mug. The coffee had gone cold, but I didn't move. The TV murmured in the background, flashing headlines of arrests, resignations, hearings. Names I used to salute, faces I used to trust. They were calling it a scandal, a systemic failure. I just called it what it was, the truth. It had taken 10 weeks of digging, one failed meeting and a hidden recorder. It had taken the last of my reputation inside the walls of Fort Brazos. My uniform now hung in the back of the closet. Not dishonored, just done. I didn't lose rank. I didn't get court-martialed. But everyone knew I was the one who broke it open, and no one sticks around long after the spotlight dims. There are always new names to call the problem. Emails kept coming. Consulting gigs. Security clearance reviews. Even a few polite invitations to speak at panels about ethics and reform. I opened them, scanned them, closed them. None of them felt right. Then one message caught my eye. Subject line was simple. We need someone who tells the truth. It was from a non-profit hospital system in Colorado. They didn't want a title or a face for a brochure. They wanted someone who knew what it meant to count lives in spreadsheets. Someone who had watched corners get cut and still chose to speak. I wrote back that night. No pitch. No speech. Just one line. I'm in if you're serious. They replied within the hour. And just like that, I had a new post. I didn't blow the whistle to become a symbol. I did it because I've seen what happens when silence gets comfortable. I did it because my father's limp came from a shipment someone signed off without checking. I did it because no one should bury their kid knowing the equipment failed before the mission ever began. I looked back at the screen. The last headline faded to weather updates. The story was moving on, but I wasn't. Not really, because even without the uniform I still had the mission. Keep people alive. Make sure someone somewhere checks the seals and signs the papers for the right reasons. And if I have to do that from a hospital basement instead of a military base, so be it. The work matters. The truth matters. And I'm not done.